webinar series, where we spotlight topics designed to equip business leaders with the insights necessary to strategically approach the complex business issues and uncertainty that surrounds us. Deeper Insights features industry experts, thought leaders on crucial subjects, who allow viewers to enhance their perspective and overcome challenges quicker. I'm Brandy Hunter, the Operations Manager for Tech Canada, and I'm pleased to host this latest installment of Tech Canada's Deeper Insights webinar. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Chip Espinoza. Chip is a co-author of Managing the Millennials, Millennials Who Manage, and Millennials at Work. He's also the Dean of Strategy and Innovation at Vanguard University of Southern California, and an instructor in the UCLA Technical Management Program. Chip keynotes internationally as a leading expert on generational diversity in the workplace. His client list includes organizations like the Boeing Company, Microsoft, Special Olympics, and the US Department of Defense. Chip is the go-to person for news agencies on the topic of integrating younger workers into organizations. He is a content expert for CNN and also has been featured on Fox News, CBS Radio, and in major publications. Chip was named a top 15 global thought leader on the future of work by the Economic Times and listed as a top 500 influencer by the Orange County Business Journal. Leadership is not getting less complex and therefore requires new competencies. One such competency is understanding a diverse workforce. It is possible you could be managing 5 different generations. Today, Chip will help us understand motivation, recognition, training, reward, feedback, and other critically important management competencies as they relate to each generation. Before I hand everything over to Chip, I'll cover off a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation and handout will be made available for download in the comments section of both our Zoom webinar and LinkedIn Live. And the recording of this webinar will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel. If you have questions, please use the chat function and we'll be sure to get to as many questions as possible. All right, I'm pleased to once again welcome Chip to our Deeper Insights webinar. Chip, welcome.
Thanks, Brandy. It's been great to work with you and Stephen, and I've been looking forward to this presentation. And obviously, it's a topic that I absolutely love, and I continue just year after year to be amazed at how it's not slowing down as far as the challenges that organizations are facing and the fact that they want to learn more about generational diversity. So today, what I'm going to do, just to let you know up front, one of my concerns whenever we talk about any kind of problem that we're trying to solve in an organization is building a theoretical framework for the discussion. So it's not just a web search saying, oh, this generation likes Wheaties, this generation likes Pop-Tarts. It's about why is there generational diversity? Where does it come from? How does it happen? So the first part of what I'm going to present really is to equip you for conversations for decision making. So when you're sitting around the table with your colleagues, or you're having to make decisions about budget and spending on training and development or whatever it is, that you are equipped with a discussion that goes deeper than just these anecdotal things or labels that we place on people. Another thing I want to say up front is that whenever you talk about generations, you're making some generalizations. And so just because somebody's a certain age doesn't mean that they're all exactly the same way. However, there are perceptions of generations that, if acted upon, create a reality for people in our organization. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our slideshow, and we'll begin. All right. So when you look at the topic, initially, most of my research for Managing the Millennials was done in North America. So Canada, the US, and I had some companies from Mexico, or at least operated in Mexico. And I really thought it was kind of concentrated here, but as I got out and I started to work for multinationals, it was really more pronounced in other parts of the world. And it made sense, because if you look at Eastern Europe post-communism, a lot of the managers where people that grew up under communism who had a certain expectation of what their career would be like and their upward mobility. Now, all of a sudden, they're managing people that want to be entrepreneurs, own their own companies. And so this sense of misunderstanding or this the gap of expectation of work is rather large. Same thing in India, same thing in China. And so immediately I started getting invitations internationally. And so to my surprise, I'm published in Polish, Indonesian, Chinese, Spanish, and the list continues to grow simply because of some of the stuff I'm going to tell you in the theoretical framework, why that is. So one thing I want to ask and want you to think about, and you can respond in the chat, is what would you like to get out of this webinar? What would you like to be a takeaway or that you could go? Now, to me, when you look at training and development, two things have to happen. One is self-efficacy. That is that after this webinar, you go, I can do this. I can implement these skill sets. I can think and analyze things this way now. And the other is observed competency. And so that's when you go back into your organizations and people go, wow, you learned a lot and I see a difference. So in order to get that self-efficacy and observed competency, I want to make sure that we're addressing some of the areas that you would like to develop in, or at least that you're interested in. And then Brandy will bring those to my attention when she's got a few of them. I want to start with the notion of generational theory. Now, prior to Karl Mannheim, who was a German sociologist who wrote a paper called The Problem with Generations back in like 1923, prior to him, a generation was talked about more like a family system, a grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, grandfather, son, grandson. And what he argued was that change in society could create a generation or a group of people who had a like worldview or mindset. And he said, normally that mindset or worldview is established during adolescence. So it's really people of a similar age going through experiences in their formative years, things like technology change, pop culture, social political events, parenting styles, educational system. The last two there are really huge in shaping how people interact. And so Mannheim would suggest that the more change in society, the greater the distance, or not distance, the greater the difference you may observe between generations. And so before I go any further, a lot of people say, well, what are the years? And obviously, I've been doing research since 2004 in this space. And you have people, anything you read, you'll see that dates could be 2-3 years off. The key is that generational analysis is not an exact science. So what we do is we take a marker at one end of the birth cohort and put another one at the other end and look and say, what's going on here? And so the people that are on the edges or the sentient boundaries, they could fall into either generation as far as what their values, thinking, behaviors, those kinds of things, or they could even kind of share those with both generations. So if you look at the builders, silents, and traditionals, most people have them between 26 and 45, the baby boomers between 1946 and 1964, Generation X, 1965 to 1982, the Millennials, 83 through 2001, Gen Z, 2002 through 2020. So if you're on this webinar today and you go, I was born in 1982, but I want to be a millennial, you can be a millennial. So don't worry about it. The issue is, like I said, is we're just trying to look to say where there may be difference. Now, I'm asked this question a lot in this space. Hasn't every generation always had a problem with the next generation? And the fact of the matter is, yes, you can go back into ancient literature and you can talk about how older generations felt about younger generations. And there's a term for it. And Norman Ryder out of the University of Nebraska coined this phrase in 1965. It's called, and if I had a rock band, this is what I would name it: demographic metabolism. And what it means is when an aging population in society is moving out of the leadership of our institutions and organizations, and younger generations are following, he says you have the potential for tension, conflict, destruction. He says you also have the potential for regeneration, renewal, and for it to be constructive. He said it's really about seeking to understand one another in that transition. And so his point was that whether you believe in demographic metabolism or not, it's going to happen. And one of the things that I see in organizations a lot of time is that they operate as this is not taking place right now. You can see it in family-owned businesses where there's no succession plan. You can see it in corporations. You can see it in religious institutions. And what is taking place is that this is a natural phenomena that we have to look at, and we have to try to understand each generation. Now, there's a concept in sociology, and it's called group norm theory. And what it says is the large group is the dominant group, and the dominant group gets to set the agenda for everybody. And if you don't follow that agenda, then you get sanctioned or punished in reality. And so when you look at the birth rates, and this is just the US that I pulled out, the builders were a little under 60 million. The baby boomers were almost 80 million. Gen X was a little over 60 million. Millennials were over 80 million. Gen Z, about 67 million. And so what you can see here is the baby boomers were the dominant group in our organizations for over 3 decades. This holds true really across the world, by the way, as far as the demographic shifts. And so the baby boomer has been able to dictate how work is done. Now, when Gen X came into the workforce, they wanted work-life balance. And the baby boomers called them slackers because they couldn't understand it. Baby boomers live to work, and Gen X works to live. And so then the millennials came in, and Gen X has said to them, and baby boomers have said to them, well, you're entitled, you expect everything without having to do what we had to do. And then Gen Z coming in are probably, my publishers asked me to write about them, but there's not enough of them as professionals in our organizations to really look and say, well, this is what they're like. But if you look in the crystal ball, there's some things about them. They're more activistic. So where the millennials came in with an expectation of having voice, Gen Z even comes with a greater expectation for that. Now, what's interesting, when the baby boomers came in the workforce, the builders told them to leave their problems at home. And so the baby boomers, the HR movement exploded under baby boomers because they said, we've got problems. If we get help with them, we'll be more productive. Now, if you look at these demographics here, I call Gen X relationship brokers in the workforce. They can interpret baby boomer behavior to millennials, and they can interpret millennial behavior to baby boomers. And so if we didn't have them in the workforce, I think we'd have UFC fighting every day. But where tension is growing between Gen X and baby boomers, and many of you might be experiencing this right now, is the psychological contract that the baby boomer had with Gen X was just do your job, do it well, be loyal, and you'll get my position someday. And what we're finding is that baby boomers just aren't leaving those high-level positions, and Gen X is growing impatient with that. At the same time, they're watching their younger peers, the millennials, leapfrog them in position with 10 to 15 years less experience. And so when you look at some of the tension, you say, well, why is this such a big issue? It really is about demographics. And the fact is that the large group is going to be the one that's going to set the agenda. And most of the conflict up till to today has been between the baby boomer and the millennials, simply because vying for being able to dictate or really push their will on organizations for what they want out of the work experience. Now, if you look at the world population by age cohort, you can see Gen Z will be the largest generation moving forward. A distinction here is a lot of that population will be out of India, China, and Africa. And so still a lot of like North America, Western Europe, Japan, those areas. I think millennials probably will be that baby boomer generation that will be large and in charge for years. So there's a concept called age cohort effect. And what it basically means, each cohort responsive to social change exerts a collective force for further change in social roles, social values, influencing other age cohorts. So even this morning, Stephen posted something on Tech Canada talking about how millennials really want a social responsibility contract or work for companies that are socially responsible. So you can see a social value there that's really become more and more pronounced. It's not that other generations didn't care, but this is, when you look at prioritization of values, this is becoming a higher value to younger professionals, and will hold true with Gen Z as well. So the fact of the matter is, every generation thinks of itself more highly than it does the other generations. And every generation, to some degree, is trying to push its will on the other generations. And that's where you get this sense of tension and conflict sometimes. So when you look at just the sheer numbers, you can see where millennials are the largest part of the workforce since 2015, and they'll continue to be for many years. So when you look at it, when you really look at the chart, baby boomers were the largest generation until 2013. Gen X was the largest for 2013 and 14. So for 2 years, and then it became the millennials in 2015. Over half the world's workforce by far is a millennial now. So this idea of understanding generations is critical on every generational level, because it's helpful to that millennial now that's managing people that are older than them. Now they have to flip the chart and they have to say, how do I better understand the person that reports to me? How do I understand their generation? And so that's why it's critical, as in what Ryder said, is that we seek to understand each other. So I'm asked this question, and I think they say, well, what do you think is the number one reason why this is such a hot topic and has been for so long? And this is the answer I give them. Young professionals are the first generation who has not needed an authority figure to access information. Matter of fact, the last place a young professional will go with a question is to an authority figure many times. And the reason for that is that they've grown up in a world that they'll search the internet everywhere else before they're going to go to the authority figure. Well, the authority figure then interprets that behavior that they're not interested in their job, they don't care, or perhaps they think I'm antiquated and don't have the answers. And so in not only that, many of you that are on this webinar today, your only upward mobility in your career was to build a relationship with someone older than you and suck up to them, do their dirty work to get your opportunity. Well, I shouldn't project my story onto you, but literally I crunched numbers for other professors. I did editing. I did all. Why? Because the way for me to go up was to build that relationship. Well, think about this. If you don't have a felt need for an authority figure to advance, then you don't know how to communicate with people that are older than you or authority figures, which creates this disconnect. Now, in my research, 1 in 5 young professionals are very good at communicating with people older than them. They're the first ones to get the job. They're the first ones to get the raise, the first ones to get the promotion. They're not more skilled. They're not better educated. They simply have the ability to communicate with people older than them. Now, I saw something also too that was posted. I think it was a little poll that Stephen put up on mentoring. And one of the things, so I added this slide for this morning because a lot of mentoring programs go south, not because they're not well-intentioned, but there is a mismatch of expectation out of what a mentoring relationship is. I'll give you an example. So the traditional definition is that you have this older person with experience that really is kind of like the picture, and the mentoree is a cup and just pouring stuff into that cup. And it's pretty much a one-way relationship. It's what the mentor thinks is important to teach the mentoree. Well, the mentoree today really looks at a mentor as someone that they can bounce their ideas off of, what they want to do, what they've written. And so what it's done, it's kind of confused people that have that traditional definition, because they're not really into going and listening to someone talk with less experience and to evaluate it. So I'll just tell you, if you're doing mentoring programs, make sure that you have a mutual definition of what that relationship is before you start it. Now, mentoring is important, bringing younger people up, integrating them, keeping them, simply because as you see the baby boomers accelerate retirement now, which was slowed by 2008 by the Great Recession across the world. Now you're starting to see it accelerate. And so many companies are going to get caught off guard because, like I said, they're not paying attention to demographic metabolism. The County of Orange here in Southern California called me and asked me to do a presentation. They said, well, we're not really sure, what we have. And I said, well, why don't you do a workforce audit? And so when they came back, they found out 60% of their employees are currently eligible for retirement, which they're not prepared for in any way. So in preparing for that transition, for that young professional from college into career, I went out and I did research. This is international now, as I was working across the world. And my sample was people who had been in career 4 years or less. And I asked the question, what is the biggest challenge you faced transitioning into career? And these are their responses. They are ordered by frequency of response. So I was really, it made sense, but I was kind of fascinated that the number one thing that they understand about themselves is they lack experience. It's the reason they don't get the job. It's the reason they don't get the promotion or the raise, because what they want to have is more opportunity, not being taken seriously. And by the way, when you look at older workers that work for younger managers, not being taken seriously, not getting respect are two high things that they are concerned about in working for someone younger than them. Why? Because all of us want to be listened to. We want to be accepted. We want to fit in. Being perceived as entitled, there's a frustration with that simply because that's just kind of out there. It's the moniker. It's probably the number one label. And what I say to young professionals in that is that if you show gratitude, you'll overcome the perception of entitlement. And gratitude is a lost art in our society. And I mean, it's every generation lacks gratitude. But when you start to show gratitude for people that invite you to meetings, they give you a tip, they spend time with you, they tell you about their career, and you acknowledge that, what you're doing is enforcing that behavior, reinforcing that behavior, but also you are overcoming that perception that you're just a taker and that you don't value or appreciate it. A lack of patience. This is one that they just say, they know this about themselves. I do a lot of onboarding events, and I will ask the question, I think, what is the greatest weakness of your generation? And two things always come out, and they're both on this list. One, they say, is we lack patience. And part of it is they've grown up in a world that they have a little more control over how they advance than previous generations. Let's take video gaming as an example. I recently worked with 3 video entertainment companies, and it was fascinating. So we were talking, I said, you've created this for us, really, because somebody can advance at the pace and the level they want to in that game. It just depends on how much time they want to put in. And so when you look at it and they transition this kind of idea to work, it's like, I'm willing to do all this and do the extra, but I want to accelerate my career faster than my peers because they're not willing to, or whatever they say. Getting helpful feedback is another one. Now, I'm sharing this list with you because many of you may be responsible for onboarding or to some degree recruiting, so that you'll understand, these are the areas that they're feeling the most pain in. Feedback is a critical thing. One of the hard things about management, span of control has grown through the years. So a lot of times, the only time a manager gives feedback is when something goes wrong. And so it's really about giving helpful feedback on developmental issues, those kinds of things. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Understanding expectations, miscommunication with older workers. That one surprised me. They really want to have a good relationship with older workers, but something just falls apart. Part of it is, what you'll see in a minute, is generations can say the same thing, but have 2 total different meanings. And so they'll walk away kind of puzzled and confused with one another. Rigid processes. Here's something I like to say about young professionals. They come in from day one, they start criticizing the way you're doing things. They could be done quicker, faster, cheaper. And that's not because they think you're an idiot. It's because they want to put their mark on your organization. They just don't want to be part of the status quo. They want to belong in. And so a way that older generations look at that, sometimes they push that behavior off. And it's a mistake. I told one CEO, I said, if you hire a young professional who's not challenging your processes and systems, they're not giving 100%. And it totally shifted this person's view of her younger employees. And so it's really saying behind all that is them trying to prove their value. So working with young professionals, the people with the most responsibility have to adapt. This is something that I say over and over again. And by the way, if you are a young professional managing somebody older, you're going to have to be the first to adapt. You have the most responsibility. The most critical aspect of integrating young professionals is the quality of relationship they have with a manager. And so if you look at, people say, what are the 2 silver bullets? Well, one is a good relationship with the manager, and I'm not talking about BFFs. One is a good relationship with the manager, and the other is career development plan. If those 2 are missing, you can't expect to retain or keep them in your organization. I think one of the greatest threats in the next decade for many organizations is going to be knowledge transfer. And by that, I mean tacit knowledge that is experiential. It's been learned over a career. And the only way that tacit knowledge gets exchanged is through a relationship. So if you have a breakdown in relationship and a disconnect, you're not going to get that knowledge transfer that you need, that's going to be so critical to competitive advantage. So when we look at understanding generations, here's a tool that comes out of the neuro-linguistic processing literature, and it's called perceptual positioning. So if I were to say to people, I was going to say on the left side of this webinar, everybody who sees that person on the left, write a description of the tree. Everybody that's on the right side, I want you to write a description of the tree from that perspective. Well, when I get the papers back, everybody that's writing the perception from the right side is going to have much more detail and description of what that tree is, simply because they've broadened their perspective. Perceptual positioning really is about playing three roles. The first position is to see, hear, and feel a situation as yourself. And that's where, when you're having a conversation, or perhaps there's been kind of miscommunication or conflict, what was I feeling? What was I thinking? And then you suspend that and you go to the second position. And then you try to say, well, what were they seeing, hearing, and feeling in this situation? And then the third position is to go to kind of 30,000 feet and say, okay, looking down at these two people, what is happening here? What are the dynamics? So to some degree, what I've done so far with giving a theoretical framework is to give you a third position perspective, to really kind of say, here's the context for what's going on here. Now, if you spend all your time in the first position, you're a narcissist. If you spend all your time in the second position, then you're codependent. If you're in the third position all the time, it just means you're like this disengaged, disinterested person who's not really committed. And so when we look at perceptual positioning, it can be used in all kind of different facets, but social linguistics, medium of communication that you use, conventions. Now, conventions are really, they're generations that have this kind of unwritten understanding about the way you should act in certain situations. And for instance, if you told someone in an older generation, hey, you have an idea, your boss isn't taking your idea to her boss, and so I think I'm going to do an end run around my boss. An older person would never do that, right? It's an unspoken, unwritten thing. Man, that's just inappropriate. A younger generation will come and go, no, I'm frustrated because this is a great idea and I could be a VP if my boss's boss likes it. And so there are just certain things or ways of behavior. The way you show up to an interview is a convention to some degree. I had an issue with an HR person that really wasn't getting quality candidates because she was put off by the way they looked when they came to interview. And at the end of the day, she said, well, I would never show up that way for an interview. And I said, well, why don't you do a pre-Zoom interview before they come to the company? And then you tell them, this is our expectation when you come here, because your first impression is really marginalizing your opportunity to attract people that you need. Now, I was thinking one day, if you look at the generations, what motivated them when they first went to work, you could see for the builder, it was basic needs. It was physiological safety needs. The way builders demonstrated how they loved their families was to provide for them. And so a paycheck was what they were going to work for. Matter of fact, I do management training, and I will have a young professional manager and a builder manager. And the builder will say, I don't understand why a paycheck's not enough to motivate you. And you can see why. It's because their major motivation was to cover basic needs. The baby boomers came in more at belongingness and love needs. And so for them, belonging to organizations was critical. So under the baby boomer, you saw professional associations explode, country clubs, all kinds of club life, because you could belong to them and it was their place and they could find title there because titles are valuable to them. And so they came in more at the psychological need, because when the baby boomer came in, you were seeing disposable income grow like 4 times that of what the previous generation had. Gen X comes in more at self-esteem needs. And then millennials and Gen Z, you talk to them about what they want out of work is they want to find meaning. They want to express themselves. They want to make a contribution. And so that's how you can look. Now, does this mean all of us don't have to fill these basic needs and earn a paycheck? It doesn't mean that. It just means, what is your major motivation? What is driving you? Where are you discontent in this model? So understanding baby boomers, they value position and title. They are optimistic. They expect others to respect their authority, their experience or position. And feedback is something they give. Even if they are the subordinate in a relationship with a younger manager, they still think their role is to give feedback. Now, this was a survey done by the Conference Board of Canada, and they asked every generation, what do you think is your greatest strength in the workplace? And they asked every generation, what do you think are the greatest weaknesses of other generations in the workplace? So what you see in red is where a self-perception of the contribution the generation thinks they're making, whereas the other generations totally disagree with them. So the self-perception for the baby boomers gives maximum effort, open to change, willing to learn new things, and the other generations, not so much. Understanding Gen X, they value independence, but will work on teams. They're pessimistic. They're the first generation that did not think they would have a better lifestyle than that of their parents. They expect authority figures to leave them alone, and feedback is just feedback. Their self-perception is see themselves as giving a greater effort than other generations and being results driven. And of course, the other generations didn't see them in that light. Millennials, career development is their love language. I like to say this, ambiguity is their kryptonite. They will make decisions by indecision. I'll go back. Ambiguity is their kryptonite, meaning that they struggle with not having clear detail on what's expected of them. And that's where I go back to the educational system. I mean, we have syllabus now in the university. Of course, I taught in the 90s, had 4 pages. Now it has 35. By the time you add in all the check boxes, rubrics, and everything else. And I think what's happened in the educational system is educators don't want to argue about grades. So that's why they do it. They don't want to have that conversation. And I think it's done a disadvantage to young professionals when they go to career and to their managers, because they really don't know how to have a conversation. So this ambiguity is their kryptonite. If you want to freak a young professional out, just be ambiguous. Now, early career, they need a lot of detail in what's expected of them, so they don't feel like you're setting up for failure. But as you move them towards management, they've got to learn to grow and be comfortable with ambiguity. They'll make decisions by indecision, not because they're can't come up with good answers or decisions. They're afraid to make the wrong decision. They put a lot of pressure on every decision they make. And if you think about it, again, you go to the educational system, well, if you don't take this course, you won't get in here. If you don't go here, you won't get here. And so it's this whole thing of not wanting to make a mistake their whole lives. And so it carries over later into work. And they expect authority figures to be for them, meaning that in their life prior to work, most every authority figure that they've been with has expressed that they're there to help them get where they need to go. Matter of fact, in my research, in the effective group of managers, many of them had volunteered in youth organizations. And they were very comfortable with initiating a relationship with someone younger and helping them. And so that's the baseline expectation many young professionals come in. But once they get into work, they start to discover that, hey, this person is not for me. Not only are they not for me, they're antagonistic to where I'm going or how I want to develop. And so the self-perception here is that they listen carefully, give maximum effort, and ask for help when needed. And the other generations said, not so much. The crystal ball on Gen Z, they prefer to communicate face-to-face with colleagues. This is out of my research with college freshmen over 3 years. They're interested in multiple roles at the same company. They prefer competition over collaboration. Matter of fact, millennials, if I said, do you want to do a team project or an individual project? Millennials said, team project, team project. When I go to Z, they say, we want individual projects. We don't want team projects. They're pragmatic and realistic, similar to Gen X. Yes, Brandon?
Hey, Chip. Great. We have a question from our audience, and I know that you talked about this at the start of the webinar, but maybe it's a great time to just reiterate. But isn't there a danger in making broad assumptions about individuals based solely on huge demographic categories? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's unfair to label everybody just because they're in a generation. But the point that I'm trying to say is that happens. And because that happens, you have to get clarity on understanding, well, is there an explanation why they're perceived that way? Is there a positive one? For instance, that whole idea of challenging processes. It wasn't being obstinate or trying to be recalcitrant. It simply was trying to add value. And so, but if your behavior is perceived in a certain light by any generation and they treat you that way, then it's going to create a barrier for you. And that's why I wrote Millennials at Work, is to say, look, whether you're this way or not, this is the environment you're going into and the perceptions that people are operating with. And this is how you overcome those perceptions.
Great. Thanks, Chip.
Great. So one of the key things that I saw in the effective group of managers that I interviewed was they had the ability to overcome the bias of their experience. This was critical because when I talked about the people with the most responsibility have to be the first to adapt, it was where that manager was willing to suspend the bias of their own experience, to say, the way I did it or we did it growing up is the blueprint for everybody else, because it excuses someone for having to do the adaptive work. And so if you can't suspend the bias of your experience, you can't say, why am I bothered by their behavior, or what threats do their values represent, or how will I need to change? And not only do individuals have bias, but organizations have bias. So one of the things is your takeaways today, I hope, as you go back into your organizations, is to have conversations to say, well, one is to reflect on your own bias, perhaps. I had a large Fortune 50 company. Guy was attending UCLA in one of my courses, and I was talking about bias of experience, and he put his head in his hands and he just shook his head. I said, you okay? And he goes, yeah. Because before I came, my team wanted me to promote somebody, and he said, I didn't promote him. And I said, well, was he qualified? Oh yeah, very qualified. Everybody likes him. I said, why didn't you promote him? And he said, well, the truth of it is, after I just listened to that, he goes, I didn't get my first promotion at this company until I'd been here 5 years, and he's only been here 3 years. He said, that's bias of experience. And I said, absolutely right. So not only do individuals have that, but career organizations have it. Career advancement, organizational structure, a bias about voice, who gets to talk in meetings. I'm telling you, legacy companies are really, this is a challenge. You get these new employees coming in that feel like, by the way, the greater the education it takes for a job, the more tension you're going to see probably in that organization between generations. Simply because to say, I worked hard to prepare, to contribute, and I want to be heard. And yet they're going into legacy organizations that they looked at as being, oh man, I got to work for them, only to be told, hey, don't talk in a meeting. So I'm going to just give you an overview of the skills real quick, and then we'll do some Q&A. And these are the skills that I learned from the effective managers. This is what they did that differentiated them. And so the number one skill was show the big picture and hear the perceived weakness. And by the way, I want to point out perceived weakness, not saying it is their weakness, just a perceived weakness, is they're myopic. Simply that they only see what's right in front of them. So sometimes they don't see the cause and effect of decision-making that goes down layers in the organization. And of course, if you're new somewhere, even when you look at organizational culture, you can't possibly have that breadth of knowledge or understanding simply because you're new. Young professional value there is simplicity, usually trying to say, let's make this quicker, let's make it faster, or something that will benefit them in their job, but not really understanding its impact rippling effect through the whole organization. So show the big picture. I like to call it learning with. And in my pedagogy in the classroom, there's sage on the stage, you just lecture and test to it. And then there's guide on the side, you come alongside and you tell them what they need, and you kind of more of a personal thing. And I'm saying that the 21st century needs a different kind of teaching methodology. And I think it's learning with. And that's where you're sitting down and you're asking that person the question, well, if we make this decision, if we make that change, what do you think will happen? Rather than saying, we're not making that change. I'm your boss, listen to me. So show the big picture is learning with. It's about systemic thinking and helping them connect the dots in the organization. Skill 2, make it matter to them. The perceived weakness that they have is indifference. Some people originally called it apathy. I ran all these terms because they're pejorative, and I ran them by millennial focus groups. And I said, I'm concerned here. I'm trying to write a book that's going to help you, but I don't want you to be put off by it. And they're going, well, these terms, I think they apply to my friends, maybe not me, but they said, I think you need to keep them, partly because for me as a researcher, you have to have psychological validity. So I can't just take what managers said and kind of spin it in a way that is more positive. So that was a concern. And one of the terms was apathetic. And I had a focus group say, we're not apathetic, we're indifferent. And I said, well, what's the difference? They said, you got to give us a reason to care. And once you do, we will be totally committed to that. Their value is meaning. What does this mean? If you find someone who's absent a lot or having to redo their work a lot, I would visit this skill. Are they finding meaning in their work? And ask them the question, what part of this job brings meaning to you? Where do you see how you fit in this organization? What is the value you believe you bring to this organization? So make it matter to them. Skill 3 is include the details. This is dealing with that ambiguity thing. Perceived weakness is they're unfocused, partly because of the value of multitasking, doing several things at once. And so sometimes their focus is off, or sometimes they will nod their head that they get an assignment, they understand it, but they don't want to ask questions because they don't want to look more inexperienced than they already are. The critical thing here is to make sure that you're giving appropriate detail. Now, one of the things I like to do, and I train managers to do, is role play. So you give an assignment with expectations, timeline, budget. And at the end of it, you go, okay, now, someday you're going to be a manager. I want you to give me that same assignment. Now, if they can do it, awesome. They got it. They've got the details. They're good to go. If they can't do it, you don't embarrass them. You don't condescend. You just simply go, hey, let's give it another shot. And then go through that process again. So include the details is critical to them feeling like they are equipped for success. Skill 4 is build a relationship. Perceived weakness is that they're self-absorbed. And like I said, come by it honestly, simply because most authority figures in their life prior to work are for them. Their value is attention. Initially, millennials were amused at all of the attention they were getting. Similar to the baby boomer, really. If you look at it, still a lot of commercials are targeted at baby boomers marketing simply because the large demographic. But millennials, they were initially very amused, and then they got a little frustrated because what I wrote on it, millennial fatigue is what I call it, where all you hear is negative stuff about your generation over and over again. And so the one thing that I say is, get over it. And there's nothing you can do about it. The issue is in generational theory is that a generation doesn't see its unique identity till after age 30. And that's because they can self-define. Up until 30, all the other generations are telling them who they are or what they are. And so that's part of the dynamic here. You'll never go to a baby boomer and say, baby boomers do this. That baby boomer is not going to say, don't call me a baby boomer. A Gen X isn't going to say, don't call me a Gen X. Why? Because they've self-defined. They've come into their own in their role. And that's what will happen with Millennials, Z, and every subsequent generation. So building the relationship really is simply taking an interest in the person and caring about them. I don't know if you've ever read the friendship factor, but they say that I think 2.5 times more likely someone stays in a company where they feel they have a friend, and it's even higher when they believe their manager is a friend or treats them as a friend. Skill 5, be positive when correcting. This is a critical skill because this is where a lot of drama happens, a lot of conflict and tension. The perceived weakness is that young professionals are defensive, but they value achievement. So the first sign that something's gone wrong is very alarming to them. Why? They put a lot of pressure on themselves to produce and perform to your expectation. And so a lot of times when the feedback comes and it's negative, it's met with a defensiveness. So I learned from a millennial manager how to do this, be positive when correcting. And it's not the sandwich method that baby boomers taught. He was at the back of the classroom. He managed a relic skate shop. His buddy worked for him. His buddy walks in early to class and he goes, "Hey, where were you last night?" And his friend said, "Oh man, I got invited to the beach bonfire. I just couldn't turn it down." He goes, "Look, you and I have been friends since junior high, and we're always going to be friends. But if you do that again, you're fired. Now, where do you want to have lunch after class?" And the genius of what he did in 45 seconds was he assured his friend that the relationship was intact, in place, so that he could hear the message that was delivered. If you are giving feedback, particularly critical feedback to a young professional, they're more concerned about their quality of relationship with you than they are about what you're saying. Because in their mind, they're going, "I'll never get a promotion. I'll never get another chance. She doesn't like me." And so just simply assure them this isn't about our relationship. I like you, point something nice out about them, and then just say, this is a behavior that's we need to see changed here. And simply being positive doesn't mean putting whipped cream on something that's unpleasant. It just means focusing on fixing whatever's gone wrong. Skill 6 is don't take things personally. This is for you. The perceived weakness is they're abrasive. And I say that because a lot of their value is informality because they believe it's more authentic. So where it really shows up is they won't refer to people as their title. They'll just by first name. And I grew up in a world where it's Mr. Mrs., but our kids today, a lot of them, they're confused. One person wants to call him Mr., the other wants to call him Bob. And so it's not, again, that's a convention. And so when young professionals come in, they're informal in the way they address people because they believe it's more authentic. So just don't take it personally. Don't get hooked by things that you may mind read that really aren't their intentions whatsoever. Skill 7, put their imagination to work. By imaginative is a weakness, you go, that's not a weakness. Well, managers said sometimes they were imaginative. They were wanting to work on projects that weren't really within their job description. Or one manager said, my employee has a new idea every day and I'm exhausted. The fact of the matter is millennials are very high capacity and they're looking for opportunity to build a resume within your organization and have victories. They value self-expression. If they can't self-express at the job, it's difficult for them to stay engaged. And one of the things you may want to do, like I said, and make it matter to them, if you see absenteeism, redoing work, that kind of stuff, it might be because they're not able to self-express in their position. Skill 8 is create the right rewards. In this, perceived weaknesses is they're entitled, and simply they want to be rewarded just like anybody else. That's a value we all have. And so it's really about creating the right rewards. I had a friend who was on a project with 30 young professionals. They finished under budget, under the timeline, and he sent him a thing and he says, as a reward for all of your hard work, I'm taking you to the nicest restaurant in Scottsdale before we all head home. One by one, they texted him and said, do I have to go? Will this count against my review? And can I bring a friend? And he was so frustrated. He called me and he says, you're not going to believe this. I said, well, back up. I said, do you think it's a reward to go to dinner with you? And he said, ouch. I said, they see it as another night at work. Bias of experience, he says, I would have died to have FaceTime with my boss at that age. And I said, well, that's just not how it is today. He goes, well, what do I do? And I said, well, ask them what they want. And they all decide they want to go to Dave and Buster's. So he took them all and they could all bring a friend. He called me, he goes, they love me. They think I'm the greatest boss ever. Be flexible. And by this, autonomous. They value autonomy. In my first edition of the book, I said they wanted work-life blending. Work-life balance, but I don't believe that. I think they want work-life blending. They don't mind accessing work during their personal life, but they want to access their personal life during work. Any way that we can allow them some sense of autonomy or personal say, choice in how they do their job, you'll find them more motivated and more willing and committed. And so when you look at all of the skills, you have 3 of them are grouped into vision skills, 3 into communication skills, 3 into adapting. They all, on this heuristic shows, they work together on specific kinds of challenges like motivation, competency, consistency, those kinds of things, and they work together. So how about a little Q&A? I know I gave you a lot of stuff. I put you through a generational diversity MBA.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Chip. I'm just cognizant of time, but we do have a couple of questions. So curious as to what are the challenges that we will face as a result of leading these different generations. So being a manager and navigating all of that and in real time, keeping all of this information that you gave us in our head as we're about to enter in a conversation.
Yeah, I think the places that you need to look at, one is people that are moving out of our organizations. How do we value them? How do we get them to share their knowledge? Right. And so I think we have an expectation sometimes, but where I feel for that older worker, a lot of times nobody's recognizing or rewarding that behavior. And so I think that's one thing that we really need to look at that generation. I think we need to look at succession planning. When you look at Gen X and moving into C-level positions, is to say, this is a critical issue to start talking about and having a timeline so that we can have continuity, that we don't lose those people simply because we're not leaving our positions. I think when it comes to millennial, the challenge is going to be moving them into that managerial role. They struggle in management with managing their own generation. They're very harsh on their own generation. So it's giving them this very skill set that we're talking about here is to better understand and what to do. And I think with Z coming in, obviously that will be something that we'll have to determine of going, what is it they value? How can we recruit them and retain them? One of the challenges that I see, Brandy, is that a lot of companies get good at recruiting them. Okay. So I have a big, it's communication satellites. So they have an intern program. They bring in 100 interns a year. They get to hire the cream of the crop, whoever they want. Whoever they give a job, they sign the deal. And it's an awesome intern program. But when they come to work and they go to work for a manager, their experience is a 180 from their internship. So they call me and say, what do we do? And I said, either you've got to dumb down your intern program and make it more like your work experience, or you got to skill up your managers on how to give them that similar experience. So I think the challenge is organizations go out and read things. I think every organization has its own culture. There are different pieces to it. I'm not a one size fits all. And I think you have to look at, what is our value proposition to younger workers? And because there's some small companies that can't offer what large ones do, but the large ones can't do what the small ones can do. And it's identifying what those things are.
Great advice. Thank you. Well, that is right on cue of 10:59. So thank you, Chip, for putting up your link as well. If anyone has additional questions for Chip, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer them for you. You can find him on his website there at www.chipespinoza.com. So thank you, Chip, for our time today. It was great. I could have kept you much longer, but just like I said, cognizant of time. So thank you for helping us understand the values of generational diversity at work, but also how we can have deeper conversations that help drive business decisions. So I really appreciated how you framed that for us. So please join us in 2 weeks when we dig deeper into more pressing issues with business leaders need to know. Register for all upcoming webinars at techcanada.com. Thanks, Chip.
Thank you.